give you my place. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Guadalupe Theater, heart of the near west side of San Antonio and part of the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. My name is Cristina Bailly, and I'm the executive director of the Guadalupe, and very proud to be hosting this weekend MACRI's third annual, I believe, symposium for Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. We've been having a wonderful couple of days here in our theater with several discussions and just great, wonderful speakers and the movers of our communities, you know, the people that are working so hard in making sure that we as Mexican Americans get to live fruitful and just lives here in Texas, in South Texas and all of Texas. So I'm very proud of the work that MACRI has put together, very proud of Sarah Gould and what she's done, and we've been enjoying all the conversations tremendously. And I want to welcome all of you that have been here in the theater here in San Antonio for the last couple of days. Some of you have been hanging out. We've been having a good time. And then we want to say hello to everybody who is watching online, who is streaming these programs. We were happy to host this event, and at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, just want to let you know a little bit about some of our programs that we have happening. Coming along with, right in line with civil rights, we're very proud to be presenting a play in January. Many of you know that the Guadalupe has had a history of strong teatro chicano, and we've been rebuilding that with our director, Jorge Piña, who we're happy to have back at the Guadalupe. And in January, we're going to be presenting a play by Cara Mia Theater, which is Crystal City 1969. So this is going to be a play about, you know, this historical moment from Crystal City. It's written by David Lozano and Raul Trevino and directed by David Lozano. This play is traveling throughout the country and will make a stop here in San Antonio in January, on January 20th and 21st. And you'll be able to find more information on our website, guadalupeculturalarts.org. And the second thing that I'd like to say about our programs is to invite you to visit our Guadalupe Latino bookstore right across the street here from our theater on the corner of Guadalupe and Brazos Streets here in San Antonio. The store is open Tuesdays through Saturdays, 10 to 4. Feel free to drop by anytime. We have our selection of books. We have an author series every first Friday of the month. We have different authors that we present there, book readings and book signings. And then we also have a gallery in there, the Progreso Community Gallery, attached to the bookstore, where we have a series of rotating exhibits. Coming up next, of course, is going to be our Dia de Muertos Altares. So once again, welcome to the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, y muchas felicidades a MACRI for this wonderful, wonderful symposium. And we'll continue. Coming up next, our next presentation will be Movements for Mexican American Representation in the 21st Century Classroom. So please enjoy.
Hello, I'm Camille Phillips. I'm the education reporter for Texas Public Radio here in San Antonio, and we have an excellent panel of guests here to talk that are experts in their field. So I'm going to try and speak as little as possible and let them speak for themselves, just kind of direct time here. But we are talking about Mexican American representation in the 21st classroom. A lot to unpack there, and I'm just going to start from farthest to me on and have you all introduce yourselves, because you can do it much better than I can. But if you are too humble, I might break in.
Thank you very much, Camille. My name is Jaime Puente. I am the Director of Economic Opportunity at Every Texan. We are a statewide policy think tank that focuses on various areas of state policy, but my focus is K-12 education and the intersections of immigration policy. Thank you very much.
And good afternoon. My name is Dr. Chloe Latham Sykes. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy at IDRA, or IDRA, here in San Antonio. I work on our Texas statewide education policy priorities. We are, as many of you might know, almost 50 year, we'll be celebrating 50 years next year, next spring, educational nonprofit focused on educational equity in policy and practice. Thank you for having us.
Hi, and I'm Omar Valerio Jimenez. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio, and I teach classes on Mexican-American history, Texas history, and the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Trinidad Gonzalez. Trini Gonzalez is what I tell everybody to call me. I'm a history and Mexican-American studies faculty member at South Texas College. I'm also on one of the co-founders for Refusing to Forget, which is a public history project looking at the history of state-sanctioned violence against Mexicanos in the 1910s. And I'm recently appointed to the National Humanities Alliance Board, where we advocate for humanities funding for everybody in the United States. And then also, with all of that, I also engage in advocacy for educational equality for all children in the state of Texas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Jimenez, Trini, why don't we start with you and just talk about Mexican-American studies, and that's been a big push for the last 5 years, I believe, here in Texas, but that's been a push nationwide, longer, right, that just to get that in as part of a class that's offered here.
Right. So I'm going to give you like the 3 or 4 sentence, I guess, version of this history. It really began the more recent. Now, there's always been a long struggle to include Mexican-American content within school curriculum that goes back to the early 20th century, was various efforts of creating private schools and sort of other efforts within the public realm. But the more recent history started with Ruben Cortez Jr., the State Board of Education representative from Brownsville, who proposed simply having the creation of a Mexican-American studies class. He had no idea it was going to create, as one conservative member of the board said, a hot potato, because it received national media. The class was not created. I believe this was like 2014. However, they compromised by saying we'll put out a call for a textbook without a class, which made no sense, but that's what the compromise was. A textbook was submitted that was that had a racist depiction of Mexicanos, including Mexicanos are lazy, Catholics can't be loyal to the United States, all sorts of stuff that you thought was gone 100 years ago. We created a coalition around that and fought to have it rejected. It was rejected, but part of that rejection then was a call for the creation of a Mexican-American Studies class, which we then struggled for the next couple of years about, and able finally to accomplish that, the creation of that Mexican-American Studies class, but also created a structural pathway for the creation of African-American Studies, Asian American Studies, Native Indigenous American Studies as well. And so now we also have African-American Studies courses in Texas as well as part of that struggle. And that's what we knew all along. If we could break the door for Mexican-American Studies, we could start opening up the opportunities for other classes to be taught as well. And so that's kind of the short history of that struggle. Obviously, there's a lot of complications around it. I'll stop there.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but a big reason why we need Mexican-American Studies courses, right, is because there's not a whole lot of representation in our current main history courses, social studies courses. I kind of want to hear just where we are with that, how the limitations of that, and just efforts to kind of increase representation in just general histories courses. Is that something that Chloe, you can talk on, and maybe we'll have some of our history professors here jump in and say some things that should be added in a second.
Yes, of course. So I'm so honored to be here with experts who have informed a lot of the content and been part of that. As far as a policy update on the State Board of Education's most recent work, or lack thereof, spoiler on the news, around integrating social studies curriculum, greater representation, greater Mexican-American representation, and also just the diversity of Texas, right? The latest couple of meetings, which included actually 3, a special meeting at the beginning of August, the regularly scheduled summer meeting, and then an additional special meeting at the end of September. A lot of different things happened there. Essentially, long story short, a lot of work to update the social studies learning standards, the TEKS, that had been updated with more diverse content, more representation of history, not just a period of 10 years update, there's a lot of content there, but also more representation, a lot more streamlining of how to present material. There was a new streamlined framework around the K through 8 social studies learning standards framework of how they're actually going to be sequenced in classrooms. And there'd been over a year's worth of work by a lot of largely volunteer work groups assembled from across Texas, across party lines, representing all the state board districts that had really gone into informing this content and developing it. And this included not only the social studies learning standards that we think of as far as the required, Texas history, U.S. history getting a lot of attention, but also some of the ethnic studies courses and the additional ones that Trini just mentioned with developing American Indian Native Studies and Asian American Studies in the catalog of Mexican American and African American studies that are on the books in our learning standards. All right, so we have a decade review, decades worth of review there. And at those meetings, they essentially, took them up. We heard from a lot of excellent advocates, some of them up here now, and the state board decided to really put that work on pause at least till 2025. And the board's composition will change pretty dramatically at the start of next year. And there was really, they actually rejected a proposal to maintain the recommendations from those work groups that had really broad-based support and were really well done, high quality. So that work, I think we believe, is largely lost, was largely thrown out. The one piece that they decided to go ahead and move forward with is what was actually in statute. And I know we might get to this conversation later, but from some new civics education, I use the term lightly, legislation that required a few elements be adopted into the learning standards from Senate Bill 3. So that social studies review for over a decade of content and also some of the work around bolstering ethnic studies as well as these new courses was largely kicked down the road recently.
And to connect the dots between the other sessions for this weekend, talking about voting, right? State Board of Education spots are up for election in November. November 8th, starting Monday, that's when early voting starts. Several of those current board members are either stepping down or up for re-election, so that is something definitely to be aware of. It's all connected, right? It's not just about education in the classroom, it's also about who you elect. And so I wanted to hear about, I'm curious if there is a specific person or event or framing of history that you think needs to be corrected or included in our curriculum that's not there right now. If you have several, I'm sure you could talk all day, but we're limited here. If you kind of want to start, Omar, and then maybe go over to Trini as well. And
Sure.
if you also have ideas, I'm sure we all would love to hear it. But
I mean, I think, and we're talking about K through 12 education, right?
let's start there. If you
Sure.
have something that you think is important.
Sure. I
higher
mean,
ed
I'm not as familiar with the TEKS, I think, as Trini is, but I've given a few workshops to teachers, and I think one of the things that's also always important is to emphasize the Mexican American and Latino historical figures that have been around in Texas and have been active since the 19th century, right? We tend to focus on sometimes the sort of more prominent figures in Mexican American history in general, like Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta, and we forget people like Jovita Hidar, Juan Cortina, Juan Seguin, for example, and when they're mentioned very, very, very briefly. And I think, learning more about these people, or Carlos Castañeda, who was a historian, Jose T. Canales, who I think the Refusing to Forget project is drawing more attention to a state legislator, and someone who was very active in the creation of LULAC, for example. I think those are important figures to point out, and I think it's good to have historical figures from every sort of decade, and not just look at the most, like the Civil Rights Movement, for example. And I think what that shows partly is that Mexican American civil rights have been around, activists have been around since Texas became independent, right? At least in terms of advocating for more rights for Mexican Americans, for citizenship rights. And one of the ones that I always try to emphasize is Juan Seguin, because people know Juan Seguin, some of people know Juan Seguin as someone who helped the Austins, Stephen F. Austin, Moses Austin, acclimate to Mexican Texas, as well as Erasmo Seguin, his father. But what they don't know is that he was the last ethnic Mexican mayor in the 19th century. And he left Texas under the threat of, he had received death threats and from Anglo-American settlers. And when he left, he was the sitting mayor of San Antonio. And we didn't get another ethnic Mexican mayor in San Antonio till Henry Cisneros in the 1980s, right? And think about that, it's a long period. And I think that's one of the things that isn't emphasized when we talk about once again.
So if you don't talk about the further back history, then it can be perceived as all of the efforts for Mexican American civil rights is something recent, but we haven't had strong leaders for centuries, right?
Right, and that the problems are of recent, recent decades, and there haven't been. There's been, struggles for educational reform since the mid-19th century.
I just want to add, and I don't want to get into the details of the standards and what's included and not included, because I agree with everything Ahmad has said. But this is how I explain it to people. This is what I explain to my students every semester is, if your community's history is not included in the official curriculum, that is a value statement of the society. And that means if you're absent from the curriculum, that means currently the community doesn't value you because your history and your community's history is not important enough to be taught. And so those absences or silences is very much something that negatively affects the whole community, right? Because then the wider community doesn't understand major demographic components of its society, right? And so it's always about the value. Your value is what you put in the textbooks.
Yeah, thank you. I want to kind of move on to all the pushback we've seen lately, right? There's been a lot of legislation across the country under the phrasing anti-critical race theory, which is a bit of a misnomer, as we all know. Critical race theory is a college-level course, but it has the effect, right, Jaime, of talking about, of limiting sometimes what can be taught in the classroom.
Thank you very much for that. And to follow up a little bit on what Dr. Garcia and Dr. Gonzalez were saying is much of the inspiration behind these quote-unquote anti-CRT bills are direct response to the things that they're teaching in their classrooms to students, and then students are going and being active and engaging in their society based on what they're learning in Mexican American Studies classes, based on what they're learning in African American Studies classes. And we saw that in 2019 and 2020 when, across the country you see kids who are, young people who are activated and engaged with the knowledge that they're being provided in an ever-changing world. And so they went and they took to the streets and they worked to change the world in which they lived. And then what happens in the very next legislative session, we see state lawmakers try and clamp down on the power that students were taking for themselves from the things that they were learning in their classrooms. And that's, one of the things that SB3 and the previous legislation that passed did was take away the rights of students to engage in civic activity as part of their normal curriculum.
And if I could add just a little bit to that as well, Jaime's exactly right that House Bill 3979, which passed last spring in 2021, had this large effect of, it's a really messy bill, a large effect of, creating these prohibited concepts, sometimes called divisive concepts. It's part of a national movement of legislation for that same effect, of a chilling effect on how you talk about race, ethnicity, gender identity, history, and so much more in an honest and accurate and reflective way. So it had all these concepts that affected social studies, and then in Senate Bill 3, which passed during one of the special sessions, those concepts and how they limited classroom conversation were expanded to all subjects, K through 12, and including, and this was in the original legislation too, that civic engagement piece, how students actually earn credit for participating in civic life and participating in democracy and putting what they learn in the classroom into action in society, and really heavily restricting how students actually gain credit for that type of leadership opportunities. So it took it a step further, I think, and from taking the lessons of what we've seen youth be able to demonstrate and then broadened it to how that affects a lot of different subject areas and a lot of different curricula pieces from that.
And another step in that same vein, it's a response to the 1619 project from Nicole Hannah-Jones. It was the Texas 1836 project, correct, Professor Valerio Jimenez? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So the 1836 project, and I have to look it up because I don't know the bill, but I think it's Bill 2947, created this committee that was to write a patriotic history of Texas. And this patriotic history, it was a 15-page pamphlet that is going to be distributed at the DMV when you get your license. And one of the things that I ask myself right away is, what do they mean by patriotic education, right? Or patriotic history? And I think what they mean, after reading articles about the politicians who were supportive of this, is they mean a history free of criticism, a history that is sanitized, a history that really leaves the best parts out, I think. I tell my students when I'm explaining, what this pamphlet was trying to do is that, no one wants to see a movie where all the protagonists are perfect, where they have no faults, right? Because it's not realistic. And no state in the country is without fault. But that's what they want to present in this pamphlet. And I've read it. Trini's read it. We've had a panel about the 1836 project at a recent conference held here in San Antonio, and it's a very sanitized history that doesn't delve into what most of us would find interesting in history. That there's these ideals that perhaps the state constitution or the nation's constitution proclaim, and we know that neither the state nor the nation have lived up to those ideals at various points, and that's why there's been various civil rights movements. And I think this pamphlet sort of does a disservice. And what I focused on recently when I gave a presentation on the 1836 project is how it covers Native American history and Mexican American history. And for Native American history, for example, they only mention two Native American groups, the Caddo Indians and the Comanches. And one of these was not native to Texas. The Comanches were not native to Texas. So those are the only ones mentioned. And they mention basically these groups in the Spanish colonial and in the Mexican national period, and then they pretty much disappear from the pamphlet. So one of the things that you get, which is often the case in other kinds of history textbooks, is this idea that Native Americans have disappeared and that they're no longer with us. And we know that Native American groups are very active in San Antonio, in the state of Texas. And the other thing that we don't get in this pamphlet is the effects that the Texas Revolution, or even before that, Spanish colonization, the forcible gathering of Native American groups and placing them in the missions. We don't get the pamphlet doesn't describe the effects of the Spanish colonization and later the Texas Revolution and the U.S.-Mexican War, how that impacted Native American groups, how there was wars directed against them, wars of extermination, and how they were forced out of the state, so that by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, very few Native American groups had land in Texas that they could claim as their own. And the same thing applies for Mexican Americans. They mention, the pamphlet mentions a few, sort of illustrious Tejanos, like Juan Seguin, Lorenzo de Zavala, but they don't mention that, after 1836, Tejanos became what Raúl Ramos describes as a suspect class. They were seen as perhaps not loyal to Texas, and that sort of label of perhaps being unpatriotic has followed them throughout the 19th century, especially after the U.S.-Mexican War. And the pamphlet doesn't mention anything about the loss of land that many Tejanos experienced, the loss of political power, and basically how they were sort of victims of sort of vigilantes that were trying to obtain their land. So all that is left out, and I think I won't even mention how it treats African Americans, but it's very similar. So the purpose of the pamphlet is to sort of just portray Texas as this state that has very few problems from early on. And a few problems are sort of alluded to, but they don't go into much detail about it.
And 1836, starting there, is a very deliberate choice, right? That's when Anglo power was concentrated, when it started, really, whereas, and it's kind of also a response, again, to 1619, which was in Nicole Hannah-Jones' project, was when the first slave was brought to the Americas.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, the pamphlet sort of looks at the period of indigenous rule in Texas, the period of Spanish colonial, Mexican national rule, generally as failures. You know, and they speak very, very proudly, and they have sort of very positive adjectives for the arrival of Anglo-Americans. And, you know, 1836, the Separatist Revolt, the Texas Revolution, they mention a few of the political reasons that occurred, but they leave out that one of the main reasons motivating Anglo-Texans as well as some Tejanos was to preserve slavery.
Thank you. One of the big questions we have here, if we can do it really briefly, because I want to get on and talk about where we go from here, but I don't think we can talk about Mexican-American representation in the classroom without talking about efforts to retain and reclaim linguistic heritage, Spanish. And so I wondered, Chloe, if you could talk anything about dual language and bilingual teachers and where we are with that.
Sure, and please, other panelists, jump in as well. And as far as bilingual education in Texas, Texas is actually quite unique in that we have on the books some statutory requirements of how bilingual education must be provided. A lot of districts can waive out of that, not to say that that's perfect, but that's not in every state's laws. That bilingual education, not just ESL, English as a second language, but bilingual education must be provided if over 20 students who have a home language other than English are in the same grade. So that is unique, and it's an important foundation for how we think about our programs and the state's investments and how we're able to build on that. Despite that, bilingual education has been largely underfunded in Texas. We have one of the lowest, second to last lowest funding weights in our school funding formula for how we fund bilingual education programs. We have over a 30-year teacher shortage, so a very acute teacher shortage in certified bilingual bilingual educators for those programs. And a lot of this is coming to a head. These are longstanding issues, I think, as many of the other items we've just discussed. But right now, the teacher shortage is getting unique attention. Bilingual education, you know, Texas just and I think in 2020 was the switch where we serve a greater proportion of emergent bilingual, which is now the term we use on the books instead of English learner, emergent bilingual students in our schools than California. We serve the greatest proportion in our public schools than any other state. Over 20% of K-12, pre-K through 12 public school students speak a language other than English at home. And that is incredible and a huge responsibility for our schools and our education system to be able to take up and honor and serve those students. So we have been actually in collaboration with Every Texan putting out some more information about what are these programs for people who aren't familiar or have only heard of dual language, and they think that that is the only type of program to serve students. And we've partnered with several groups in legislation that did actually pass last spring, a few items of legislation. One, to change the term from English learner to emergent bilingual, to honor students' emerging bilingualism rather than just English acquisition. Might seem symbolic in many ways, but we're talking about using affirming language that honors students' histories and home language rather than just English. So that was really unique, and actually that passed completely out of the committee, bipartisan support, not a problem. I have to say we were actually a little shocked, but we were very excited about it. And another big piece of legislation was Senate Bill 560, which tasked the Texas Education Agency in collaboration with the Coordinating Board and the Workforce Commission to create the state's first strategic plan for bilingual education, the education agency's first strategic plan. And that plan is in the drafting phases now. I understand it has to be submitted by law to the legislature by December 1st. So I think they're in the final drafting phase at the moment. And we're hoping to see if they've been able to take up, really worthwhile strategies, which I think they did a fair amount of stakeholder engagement, other types of surveys. They did have a bilingual family survey that went out to inform that process. And there are several goals that that plan must entail that were part of that legislation. Increasing the bilingual teacher workforce, the certified bilingual educator workforce, expanding dual language programs, which can't happen without that workforce, and graduating more bilingual and multilingual students from our high schools, along with several other aspects of the plan. But those are some of the key areas where we're looking for strategies to continue to be engaged to make sure those really come to fruition in the next session.
Thank you. We have about 18 minutes left. I want to leave a few minutes for questions if the audience has any. But I want to first kind of step back and say, where do we go from here, right? How do we ensure there is more Mexican-American representation in our classrooms? And also just, I want to first say, if we kind of go around and have all you say, like, why is this so important? It might be kind of obvious, feel kind of obvious, but like, what are the consequences of not having our students seen in their curriculum?
Oh, just to reiterate what I said about the values, and that a community needs to be completely aware of everybody within their society, so that there's the interactions that we can start breaking down the sort of racial and class barriers and the other sorts of hostilities that we have. But where we go from here is we need to get out and vote and run candidates and fund candidates to the State Board of Education the way Republicans do. That's the only way we're going to be able to get things past the State Board of Education. It's political. We got to organize, and we got to move forward from there.
So I would also add that I think we need to be involved in monitoring, those of you who are parents or grandparents, monitoring what your children are learning and asking teachers and principals to include more information on Mexican Americans, on Latinos, and asking bookstores to carry more books by Mexican American authors and historians. And I'm really glad that the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center has a bookstore now here that features some of these books that, in some places have been banned. So those are really important. And I would, as a university professor, Denise and I also do our part in trying to educate our students at the universities, but there's threats there too, or potential threats. There's been rumblings about doing away with tenure at the university, and that would, if it was to happen, would have a huge economic impact on the state, because there would be very few professors who would want to move to Texas knowing that they wouldn't be assured of tenure. So tenure guarantees that we have academic freedom to do our research on any topic, but especially controversial topics, and to publish on these topics. So I think it's really important to keep sort of be aware that these attacks on education are happening at various levels. And luckily for us, as university professors, we're a little bit more protected because we have tenure and because they haven't necessarily pass some of these bills about CRT and so forth, targeting us. But I think K through 12 educators are a lot more vulnerable, and I think we also need to try to support teachers who want to teach about some of these subjects.
I would echo what Dr. Valerio Jimenez just mentioned in a few ways. One, the advocacy, along with voting, the actual advocacy on who cares about these issues, how you're showing up, how it is absolutely unacceptable that they continue to be censored in the K-12 space as they have been, and in the extended conversations that might touch higher education, which we've heard a lot about in the upcoming legislative session, starts in January. So that type of advocacy is incredibly important, and we're always happy to work with anyone through our coalitions or as partners to make sure that everyone's voices are heard on those important issues. IDRA also works in practice as well, and so we do have, in light of all of this, we launched a resource hub, a school resource hub that educators and families can use and students can use to access free lesson plans, toolkits, other types of media tools. It's called the We All Belong Hub, and it's specifically on more inclusive curricula. It's at idraseen.org/hub. The We All Belong Hub. So there's free lesson plans and educational materials there. We're looking to continue building that out. to make sure that educators have that material to be able to incorporate that continuously in your courses. And then we also offer technical assistance to expand Mexican American studies. We certainly talked about how that legislation impacts potentially the future of the Learning Standards Review and Mexican American studies, but that is a course on the books for secondary schools, and we want to make sure that those programs can be supported and expanded, and that's something that we also encourage and are happy to assist with.
I think to wrap it up, one of the things that I'm going to be doing over the next year at Every Texan, and especially coming up in this next legislative session, is connecting the idea that public education and education in general are vital to the future of our democracy. We've seen recently that, you know, our democracy is under attack by a very retro-thinking cohort, people who want to, you know, take their country back. And who are they taking it back from? They're taking it back from the elders, my elders, the people whose shoulders I stand on as a graduate of the Center for Mexican American Studies at UT Austin. You know, like the folks who did this work before me. They were fighting for their lives in many instances, and they were doing things that that would get them thrown in jail and thrown into the hospital and various things, so that I could have the honor and privilege of speaking here today. And, you know, that was democracy in action. And when we try to eliminate that democracy in action from our public schools and from our universities, then we are destroying our own democracy. I forget who said it, but, you know, we're filling our own pool so that no one can swim in it. And that hurts everyone. It doesn't just hurt Mexican American kids. It doesn't hurt African American kids. It hurts everyone. It hurts every single Texan. And so in the next year, that's going to be my message, is that, you know, we have to protect public education with our lives, because that's what it depends on.
And Jaime Puente, are there any specific bills that you are going to advocate for or against? Is there anything on your radar that should be on other people's radar going into the next legislative session?
You know, one of my favorites, and one of the things that, you know, Dr. Gonzalez and Somos Mas and a lot of the Ethnic Studies Network of Texas, they've been pushing it for years. And it's focused on Mexican American studies, but it really is just an ethnic studies bill in general. And that was, I forget the bill number, but that was filed by Rep. Morales out of Houston, and it would establish ethnic studies as a foundational course in the state curriculum. So not just an elective, but something that would be a graduation requirement that students could then take and lead them into a university career.
Attorney Professor Gonzalez, I wondered, since you've kind of been in the trenches advocating for Mexican American studies to be available, do you have any lessons learned or advice for people that are wanting to advocate for more representation going forward?
Okay. Just to, I think we should give a shout out on the legislation you're talking about to Emilio Zamora and Angela Valenzuela at UT, particularly Angela Valenzuela as really the sort of the brainchild of pushing that legislation. Of course, we all support it. Concerning advocacy, advocacy is going to range from what you can do, right? And the problem in Texas is it's so big, right? Just to give you an example, we're going to have the Senate committee's hearing on the anti-critical race theory on a Monday. The chairman says, no, we're not going to have it. So people didn't show up to Austin to testify as they planned to do. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, he says, oh, we're going to have it after all. We got 2 hours to get here, right? You know, pretty much curtailing the 50-some witnesses that were going to show up. Luckily, we got 6 witnesses in. They literally closed the door. One of my friends, that she was going to grab the door to walk in, and they locked it. And they literally locked people in there, right? So that gives you the sort of the nastiness that can occur. But the point is becoming aware, reading the legislation, which is boring, but you got to read it. Knowing who to contact in the legislature concerning your representatives, knowing who to contact the State Board of Education, who are your representatives, and then getting into the networks, into the advocacy networks, and then working, if you haven't been involved in advocacy, working with them and figuring out how best you can approach these issues, and then what venues are, right? There's a State Board of Education versus what's going on in the legislature, and those are sort of 2 structural different operations. You got to be familiar with that and their rules. And so if your agenda is to get more Mexican American or more ethnic studies courses into the school system, that's where you start, right? Structurally. Now, what Ahmad and others have suggested is that you can work outside the system, providing supplemental material to students and schools that they can integrate into their curriculum as well, right? So there's that as well, and bookstores and activities that you could do in the public. So there's public engagement outside of the school districts or school systems that you can further this information as well.
Do we have any audience questions? If not, I can keep on asking questions. Okay, let's do some audience questions.
Hello, good afternoon. I know that, I believe it was Dr. Mr. Gonzalez, is that right? Okay, I'm sorry, it was Mr. Valerio Jimenez, right? You were talking about tenure. Alamo colleges just went through an awful fight about tenure. They had about 18 professors and advocates speaking to the Board of Trustees about tenure and the advantages to tenure. And I myself went up before the board and spoke about when I started college at San Antonio College in 1978, about how important it was to have tenure and about how we looked up to these professors who had been there for a long time because it shows stability and security for the student. Completely ignored, totally ignored. And Dr. Latham Sykes, I don't know if you can help with that. I mean, I don't know how that works. I know that TPR did a thing about that. There was a little blurb about it. I didn't have a chance to go through the whole thing.
Yeah, I reported on
Oh, was that you?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so it's, I think it's a big issue, and I think there's a lot of things going on. I'm dealing with a separate issue right now with Alamo colleges, but I've noticed that there's a lot of things that are being swept under the rug, swept under the carpet. This is an important thing I'm going to tell you. During COVID, a lot of federal employees, state employees, and I don't know about city employees, but they took a vacation. A lot of people took a vacation, and people were not working. They were not answering their phones. They were not answering emails because of COVID. Oh, well, we can't, COVID. And they were only showing up to work for Zoom meetings. So they were working maybe 2 or 3 days a week for Zoom meetings and vacation the rest of the time, you know. So that's our tax money going to that. The other thing is all this goes unsaid. Nobody's paying any attention. There's one person who actually became a director of Avon and was making all kinds of money selling Avon, who is a person an employee of the district office. So these are things that I think need to be looked at, and I don't know if you guys, being in education, can possibly have a look at that. But the thing about tenure is so important, and things are just, nobody's being heard, nobody's listening at Alamo colleges. So I see that you guys still have tenure, correct? Okay, in the university level.
Yes, and I want to explain a little bit about, just for those who might not know what tenure means, So at the university level, you get tenure, you obtain tenure after a certain number of years and after having taught for a certain number of years at that university, and depending on the university, also meeting certain publishing requirements. Like you might have to publish a book or a certain number of articles. Right. It depends on the university, and so at community college, it's a little different, right? But what it means is that once, it's usually it happens after 6 years that you've been there, and on your 7th year, you get tenure, at least at the university level. And what that guarantees is that you won't necessarily lose your job if you, for any activity that you might be involved with in terms of like publishing or doing research on certain topics. For example, there might be political scientist professor who might be doing research on redistricting. There might be a history professor who might criticize the 1836 project, and therefore, you don't want to. You want to have professors who can speak intelligently about these issues, but also be able to criticize government leaders or politicians, right?
Yes.
Without fear of retribution.
Right.
And when you lose tenure, that means that these professors can then be fired.
Right.
With very little explanation.
Correct.
And what that means is what you spoke to was about not having continuity, not having stability, because what happens then is the universities start hiring people on a temporary basis, and because they're hired on a temporary basis, they're also not going to necessarily, they're going to be very employees who might be more compliant and who might not want to criticize, who might just go along, and therefore, and also they could also be let go for other reasons. And so you have students who are hurt by this in many ways because they can't depend on a professor being there if they started at a university and 4 years later they need a letter of recommendation, for example, or they need advice on where to go to graduate school or where to go to law school. That professor might not be there anymore.
Exactly.
So it really impacts not just the professor's livelihood and research,
Right.
but it impacts students as well.
Right.
And I would say it impacts the community as well, because you have some of these professors who are contributing to research on San Antonio. Like UTSA has a West Side Center right here, right next to the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. And that's a sort of initiative that UTSA created under pressure from faculty and students to get more involved with West Side community, to do research on the West Side community, and to involve the West Side community in their projects, right? And that could get lost.
I don't mean to interrupt you or anything, sir, but I understand everything that you said, and thank you for elaborating on that. But I understand everything that you're saying. I'm saying that Alamo Community Colleges, there are professors that have been there for many, many years. I've seen the dedication that they've given to the students. We even have Mexican-American studies that are being done there, and we have those professors who are very dedicated to that. I've also seen some of the professors who have been advocates for the students and who actually, because they were actually blackballed for whatever reason. There's a lot that needs to be looked at there, but I don't know if it's just the board that makes that decision for no tenure, but they deserve to have tenure. We have tenure at UTSA and the other colleges here. We should have it at the community college level.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I want to make sure we have time for at least one or two more.
The board, the panelists have made a great presentation of things at the state level, both the legislature and the state board. Excellent. What about our local school boards? What do you want to say about them? What can local school boards do?
Anyone want to take that question?
Well, likewise, but school boards are going to vary from location to location, the politics of the school board, right? So I believe like in Mission, Texas, when the Department of Education came out with a statement talking about the protection of transgender students, the school board of Mission was the first, probably in the state of Texas, to pass a policy protecting their transgender students at that school, allowing to use the bathroom of their choice, right? So it's going to vary from school district, but I tell you, South Lake Carroll is not going to do that, right? And that's actually one of the kind of victories we got with SB3. We removed any sort of penalty against violating the SB3 to the district level. So districts are going to we're not going to penalize faculty for teaching what you think is critical race theory. But other districts are like, if you mention a black person, oh, that's critical race theory, we're going to fire you now, right? So there's a fragmentation going on in school districts concerning state legislature policy. Now, just like the State Board of Education, being involved in the politics of your school board is very important. It's no different, except it should be easier in the sense that you're dealing with the community right at hand where you live. MASBA could recommend to its board members, one, advocating for, and they have, right? When Mexican American Studies went up for proposal, no, when Mexican American Studies went up for the proposal of the State Board of Education, they supported it, they wrote a letter, stuff like that. This last go around, MASBA was not very vocal against the delaying of the inclusive TEKS. But so were other organizations as well. I can't get into the conversations I've had with state legislators and their staffs and stuff like that. But the consensus was that they didn't want to use their political capital when they knew they didn't have the votes in the State Board of Education, right? I disagreed with that, and they told me, keep pushing us, right? As an advocate, so you need to go fight right now. You don't let any battle go without a fight. Their position was, we don't have the votes, we're going to lose, and so we're going to let this one pass by for another fight. And those are sorts of the nitty-gritty, I never talk about nitty-gritty, those are sorts of the nitty-gritty conversations that as advocates we have with legislative staffs and legislators behind doors. So if it's MASBA's concern, as an advocate, I say you guys got to fight more and more often and get at it, right? So I'll stop there.
And if I could add just a little bit around the practice, because absolutely, school board members can be active advocates outside of their district, definitely within their district, and at the state legislature. And we've partnered with them on several items of legislation to pass them and promote. And that voice is very important in multiple spaces. But also, really standing firm and being a source of leadership amidst a lot of this censorship to say, no, we're going to protect or expand Mexican American studies, African American studies, adopt these, make sure we have the faculty to teach these courses and support those teachers with the materials to do it, know that they're not going to come under fire from the school board or from their principal for doing so. So that type of district leadership is really important for combating the chilling effect from state level legislation that has not had a lot of guidance over how to be implemented. There are no texts, there is no state list book ban in that legislation. That doesn't exist. There is the exception of saying you can't require teaching the 1619 project, but it doesn't say you need to go into classroom bookshelves and pull those off or send the sheriff into the school library. That has been an extrapolated interpretation to implement that law because it's confusing, because it's vague, and because it's scary at the local level. And so school board members, school districts, educators, knowing that information and standing firm along with students and families and community members to say, this isn't part of what we want to do, and that law doesn't say we have to do it. That a lot of this work has been done under the auspices of having to comply, and I think we were talking about compliance just now, but really, I mean, that type of local level engagement and that firm district leadership is really important.
On that note, it is 2:23, so I think we need to wrap it up unless I get the go-ahead to keep going. Maybe we should wrap up and just ask questions individually. Okay, go ahead.
My question was just about, I wanted to, I guess, ask about your suggestions for certain schools popping up. They're labeling them, I guess, traditional schools, and they're very Eurocentric based ideologies. I made the mistake of enrolling my son in a school. He lasted 3 weeks, and when we went to parent night, I sat down and I saw what they were teaching the kids. I pulled him out. He was out of school for 2 weeks, and I'd rather have him out of school than have him be indoctrinated. That's how I felt. So my question is, how do we put this on, I guess, the state's radar for them to see, to evaluate what they're teaching the kids, because they do these things where they have them praying during events. I mean, my understanding is that even if it's a charter school, they're getting state funded. So how is this possible, and how do we bring this up to somebody to let them be aware, hey, this is what they're doing to our kids. I don't want that for my kid. So.
I think that's, kind of going back to the question before, that's where a lot of involvement in the direct local processes of a school district. The problem with charter schools is that they're not your local ISD. You can't just go and elect a new superintendent for a charter school, because very often those decisions are made in California or Philadelphia or somewhere, because those are corporations that run schools. And in terms of your question about what to do for these traditional type schools that are coming up, I think that's part of why SB 3 was passed, to allow some of those types of curriculums to become the norm again, because those are the types of curriculums that sell the 1836 narrative to our kids. So instead of picking it up at the DMV or a truck stop or wherever they're going to be, these traditional schools are trying to put that very skewed historical curriculum narrative into the classrooms. And so yeah, you have to be kind of vigilant about what's happening in your neighborhood. One thing I would say is support your community schools. Go talk to your teachers, because the principal at your community school is going to be much more responsive than the principal at some charter school or some private school. Because that principal has an investment in making sure that their community is successful, because that's how they're judged, on the success of their community, and not necessarily how many kids they may put into their own college and say, oh, we have 99% graduation rate, we have 99% kids going to college. Well, I mean, if I could create a school and pipeline all of my kids from high school into college, and it be a circular funding system for my own pockets, I would do that too. but that's not educating kids.
On a personal note, if there is a complaint that the school is breaking the law, one, file a complaint with the Texas Education Agency. Two, you can always find your friendly local reporter and let us know, and maybe we can do a story on it.
Just a real quick comment. My name is Velmi Ibarra, and I'm one of the members of the MACRI board and a 42-year educator, etc., former board member, blah. First of all, the comment regarding Alamo Community College District, I must at least say that I'm not supporting what is happening of what this young lady said. I'm just saying they were not heard here. And they are probably the only community college district in San Antonio. So I don't know if it's a budget thing or what it is that's going on. What I do want to say is that I want to thank Sara for allowing this topic to be on the agenda. It is one of the just dearest topics for us as a community, because if we, right now in the fall term, school boards are making their decisions at the recommendation of principals at what the high school curriculum is going to look like next year. And if we are not there to talk at some of these school board meetings and say, dear gentlemen and ladies, may we please talk about adding Mexican American studies to our high school students. That's very important, and I must stop right there on why. Most of those kids who take Mexican American studies are seniors. 4 to 6 years after that beautiful experience of being in MAS or ethnic studies, they could come back and be our principals and our superintendents. So it's very important, not only for our community of Latinos, but for the white kids. It's only fair that they learn about our sufferings, because in all of the classes throughout the state of Texas that are happening, 99.9% of all kids, white and brown or black, appreciate what they have learned about other people's sufferings and their histories. So I think we just need to do our job to get our school boards. Thank MACRI for sponsoring symposiums in the summer to bring in teachers. IDRA for 20 years plus, sponsoring teachers to come in the summer and learn about Mexican American studies. So we've moved forward, but we have a long way to go. I want to mention one school district because I am a partial. Take a poor school district like Harlandale here in San Antonio, 2 high schools, low income, 98%. 2 full-time teacher units at Harlandale High School in Mexican American Studies. One of those teachers, half of her time, they allow her to do nothing but resources, training, providing resources to the other teacher. McCollum has 1. You put those teachers together, they're bringing in almost 250, 280 students a year that are learning about Mexican American studies. I'm going to stop right there, but that's the difference that a few teacher units can make. Thank you all for your work in MAS, all of you.
Thank you all for your questions. I want to wrap up and say thank you for listening to our discussion about movements for Mexican American representation in the 21st century classroom. I'm Camille Phillips, education reporter at Texas Public Radio, and I want to thank our panelists. We have right here Trinidad Gonzalez. He's professor of history at South Texas College. Omar Valerio Jimenez is a UTSA history professor. Chloe Latham Sykes, Dr. Chloe Latham Sykes, she is EDRA's Deputy Policy Director, and Jaime Puente with Every Texan. He's the Director of Economic Opportunity there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. We are going to take a 10-minute break while we change out for our last panel of the day. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. Can we change the slide? Thank you. Can somebody just tell me, do you have Sylvia? Okay. Welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us for the last panel of our symposium for the year. This is going to be a phenomenal panel. It's called Movements for Mexican American Representation on the Screen, Reflections on the 25th Anniversary of Chicano. With us today, for our moderator, we have the Honorable Henry Cisneros. Henry is one of the nation's most prominent thought leaders, and innovators in infrastructure investment. He is chairman and co-founder of American III Partners, a developer, investor, and manager of infrastructure assets. In 2003, he co-founded CityView, a Los Angeles-based fund manager, which has invested in and completed more than 100 real asset projects in 13 states. He is also vice chairman of Sybert Williams Shank, a full-service investment bank, and he's the former federal Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, appointed by President Bill Clinton and serving from 1993 to 1997. During his tenure, Henry led initiatives that spurred reinvestment in public housing and helped revitalize many of America's urban centers. In 1981, he became the first Hispanic American mayor of a major US city here in San Antonio, serving 4 terms. Next to him, we have Hector Galan. Hector is a prolific documentary filmmaker, contributing over 40 hours of programming to major television series such as PBS Frontline and American Experience, to cable networks, and to PBS Primetime. He has produced many critically acclaimed and award-winning independent films through his company, Galan Inc. Television Film, which was founded in 1984 in Austin. He has theatrically released his feature documentary, Los Lonely Boys, Cotton Fields and Crossroads in 2006. Just a few years ago, here at the Guadalupe Theater, I'm sure some of you saw Children of Giant, a documentary feature set in Marfa, Texas, exploring social issues throughout history, weaving a scenic exploration of the Academy Award-winning film Giant with contemporary interviews. He was the first documentary filmmaker to be inducted into the prestigious Texas Film Hall of Fame. And next to Hector, we have Dr. Tomás Ibarra Frausto, an independent scholar of Latin American and US Latino arts and culture. He was formerly the Associate Director of Creativity and Culture at the Rockefeller Foundation. Prior to joining the Rockefeller, he was a tenured professor at Stanford University in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. In 2007, citing his life work in fostering cultural understanding between the United States and Mexico through the arts and humanities, the Mexican government bestowed on him the Order of the Aztec Eagle. He's based here in San Antonio, where he's an active member of the West Side Preservation Alliance. And up on the screen, we have with us Sylvia Morales, who has directed, written, produced, and edited award-winning and nationally recognized film and video work for the last 30 years. She has directed episodes of Showtime's groundbreaking series, Resurrection Boulevard, working with actors like Elizabeth Pena, Lou Gossett Jr., Michael De Lorenzo, and Asai Morales. She's also wrote and directed for the Showtime series, Women, Stories of Passion. She was one of the producing and writing teams for the award-winning series Chicano, which we'll be discussing today. She's also directed for the ACE, an Emmy-nominated 6-hour series, A Century of Women, which focused on 20th century U.S. women for Turner Broadcasting. She headed the Latino Consortium of KCET in Los Angeles from 1981 to 1985, where she was responsible for the programming, production, and distribution of programs that aired on PBS. During her 4-year tenure at KCET, she hosted the Latino Consortium's weekly national series, Presente, and produced and directed Emmy-nominated and award-winning programs. She also produced, directed, shot, and edited the widely recognized film Chicana in 1979. She's been the recipient of numerous awards, including the prestigious Rockefeller Fellowship Award in Media, a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Vesta Award, which honors the outstanding contribution of Southern California women to the arts. Welcome, panelists. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Sara, thank you very much for, first of all, for your kind introduction of each of us. I'm honored to be on the stage with distinguished leaders from media centers, the arts, film, and intellectual thought about arts and culture. It's appropriate that I be the moderator because it's my job to somehow sort of guide us through the discussion of these really genius figures that we're honored to have with us today. I do want to thank Sara and MACRI for their leadership. This is a relatively young organization, only several years in existence, but already is putting on some very strong programs and creating a resource, a reservoir of important materials, and we will look forward to watching it grow here on the west side of San Antonio. It's appropriate that we would be here at the Guadalupe Theater, a place where generations of Latinos from the west side and from San Antonio generally have come for entertainment, for enlightenment, for discussion, for political gatherings. It's become a regular and well-known venue for that kind of activity. The course of today, and this panel in particular, is to focus on the question of participation by Latinos and Latinas in the cultural life of the country through film and other media. And we know that our participation is a fraction of what it would be if it were just in proportion to our role in the population. If we just had that level of activity, it would be a very, very different reality. We're vastly underrepresented, whether it's in figures on television or film, whether it is in the cultural forms of the country, including the foundations. Tomas was at the Rockefeller Foundation for many years, as you've heard. He'll have some thoughts about that. But these are people who, in some sense, have bucked the trend. By their careers, they have done some pretty outstanding things, swimming against the current that flows against Latino artistic genius. And so I'd like to begin the conversation by talking to Hector for a moment, asking Hector to just reflect on the years that he was swimming against the current to get things done. I had the privilege, at Hector's request, of being the narrator for the documentary series Chicano, which won an Alma Award and earned, along with his other accomplishments for Hector, some of the top awards in the field, including at South by Southwest about 2 years ago, the Texas Film Institute's highest award for contribution in film within Texas. Let's hear it for Hector. He deserves that recognition. Hector, give us just a sense of what the ground was, what it felt like as you negotiated that process in terms of your major accomplishments, and where you think we are exactly at this moment.
Well, thank you, Henry. One of the biggest problems that we have when doing shows like Chicano or shows about our history is always raising the money. And thanks to people like Tomas, Rockefeller, and also the Ford Foundation, CPB, a lot of big funders funded our 4-part series, Chicano, that was groundbreaking at the time. Organizations like, big funders like National Endowment for the Humanities wouldn't give us a dime because they thought we were too radical. You know, Chicano, a lot of people think that Chicanos are radical, and they say, well, we're not going to fund that. But fortunately, a lot of other people did it. Now it's part of history. For me personally, you know, I became part of the Chicano movement when I was a student in Lubbock, Texas, at Texas Tech. I was working my way through college, working in television, the local NBC affiliate. I was directing the news at 6 and 10. But I remember very clearly back then, Henry, when I got involved in the Chicano movement here in Texas, I was called a commie, a pinko, all kinds of things by my colleagues at, you know, those sportscasters and the you know, they knew I was part of the movement. But that eventually is what got me involved. When the first minicams came out, you know, when we were finally able to go into the streets with cameras that weren't filmed, because that's what normally you would use, very expensive. But now the minicam, that's what they were called, came out. You know, you see them here today. It's amazing how far we've advanced, but we were able to capture. At that time, you know, we've heard about Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, but when I was in the 70s, Chicanos and Latinos, man, we were dying at the hands of police brutality really bad here in Texas, all over. And so we were out there capturing marches and things like that. So when I did the series, and Sylvia Morales was one of our, she did episode 2 of Chicano. Susan Racho did episode 3, and Robert Cousins from Houston did episode 4.
Take a minute and describe the 4 episodes, just so folks who may not remember it.
The first episode is called Quest for a Homeland. It's just the general story of who Chicanos were, what we were fighting for, and why we called ourselves Chicanos, and the struggle that people had to go through to be part of it. You know, growing up in West Texas, myself, people would look down upon our indigenous heritage, you know. The darker Chicanos or Mexicans had it rough, unlike the lighter-skinned ones. And so the Chicano movement in episode 1, we talk about how we embrace our history and heritage.
So that was episode 1.
Quest for a Homeland. Sylvia did The Fight in the Fields, which was Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and the whole farm workers movement that happened in California, inspired, you know, millions. Episode 3 was on the school walkouts, focusing in Los Angeles school walkouts and those high schools, and what occurred, you know, during that. It was amazing. And the last episode was on the Raza Unida party here in Texas. But, you know, after being called all that early on doing that, when you, Henry, invited us to the White House to show President Clinton excerpts and clips from Chicano, at that moment I really felt vindicated. I really did. I said, you know, everything that I endured, at being a commie, a pinko, this or that, or radical, to actually be in the White House, thanks to Henry, was an amazing feeling, just an amazing feeling for all of us. And so, you know, I think that we've come a long way. The Chicano movement has matured in many ways. A lot of what we see today deals with immigration and DACA, and the Chicano part is almost, you know, like historical.
Tell us what you are doing today. What is your focus at this point in your career?
I'm still doing documentaries. Right now I'm doing one on, well, I'm raising money for the 2024 presidential election. It's called Turning Texas. And I'm looking at a young woman. Her name is Cristina Sinsun Ramirez. Right now she's the president of next year.
She ran for the Senate.
She ran for the Senate, yeah. But man, she's
from Austin.
We were in Mexico filming that part of her family in Morelos and in Michoacan in Day of the Dead last year. So I've been gathering all of that for 2024. And I love doing history shows, especially Texas history, and I'm starting to do R&D on a story on Chico Cano.
So your focus has remained bringing to a general audience the history, the reality of the Chicano experience, of the Mexicano experience in Texas.
That's right. to the national audience.
Right.
So you have to do it in a way to where they can absorb what you're trying to do.
And how is it different from what you were doing 20 years ago when Chicano was made? Is it harder?
It's funny that you asked that because, in terms of trying to do these stories and fundraising, it seems like it's the same.
The same.
Now, I am seeing more and more supporters, people like yourself and people that actually are starting to invest in their own history, in our history, just like Jewish Americans do with their history and African Americans.
And what do you see as the climate of younger talent that is on hand to come after you?
They're out there. As a matter of fact, next week, I'll be at the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque with all young students.
That's great.
And then here in Texas, I see a lot of young people, and the new technologies allow them to do it unlike what we had to go through. That was in the analog world.
I want to go to Sylvia, but think about sharing with us in the next round of questioning the resources that exist today that can be tapped, because I think that's a concrete thing that you can help, and there may be those in the audience
Sure.
who would benefit from that information. Sylvia, felicidades on all of your career, but especially for purposes of today, the work that you did on Chicano. This is a sort of a retrospective, a look back at what it meant in the larger picture. Tell us about what you were doing when you were selected to do that, why you felt you were the right person to do it, and then your approach to it.
I don't know necessarily. I felt I was the right person to do it because I knew Dolores. I had already worked with her before. And also, we were going to be traveling back to Los Angeles, where I was living. And of course, we came to, everyone went to Austin. That was our base. So I went back to Los Angeles and up to Bakersfield and the farm country. But you know what? That was a long time ago. This is one of the things that I talked to Sarah about. I said, I'm going to have to look up a lot of this stuff. This was, when did we do this? This was a while back.
25 years, I guess.
Yeah,
We were in production in 1994, 95,
right.
And it aired in April of 96.
Yeah.
Right, it was a long time ago. So I was trying to recall some of the things that I went through. What I remember is I was very excited to be a part of this. It was a time that my colleagues we were all going to work together to do something that we felt was important. So it was very hectic. And of course, Hector was our leader. And he was, he's a fine, I feel he's a fine filmmaker. A bit autocratic, I thought, as a boss. Nothing personal, but it was great working there, and it was hard.
Yeah.
It was hard work.
So Sylvia, what have you done in the years since in this genre, or anything else, just to bring the audience up to date on your subsequent career?
Well, subsequent to that, I got involved in directing episodic television. So I worked on Resurrection Boulevard,
right,
and also on another program called Reyes y Rey. That was filmed in Tijuana, and they wanted a bilingual director. So that was what I really enjoyed doing, more than documentaries. I love documentaries. When I'm doing them, I love them. But what I really wanted to do all my life that I can remember is direct actors, direct camera, work with story, and do it about Chicanos, Latinos, any story.
Are you working at it now?
No. In 1995, there was a problem in my family, and I adopted my niece and nephew. My niece was 22 months, and my nephew was 8 and a half. And I thought that I could do it all, that I could raise children by myself and still keep working, and that was not to happen. My fortune was that I did have a master's in film, So because of that, I got a teaching job, and I was a professor at Loyola Marymount, and recently left that. And I'm not working right now.
Yep.
I'm doing what everybody in Los Angeles does. We write scripts.
Now, in the years that you were a professor, you were developing talent in the things that you had learned and know and the experience you developed. Talk a little bit about that, the fulfilling part of preparing other young people to be the voices of our people for the going forward.
Well, what I discovered, Henry, and that's a great question, was that you can just prepare young people so much. A lot of times young people think they do know it all, and I remember me thinking the same thing. I thought I knew it all. And there are those students who are just wasting their money, as far as I'm concerned. And then there are those few who, whether I teach them or not, are going to get through because they have the determination, they have the talent, but more than anything, they have the determination, and they will find a way. So as long as we are there, I think people like Hector, myself, and the other filmmakers, they can come to us if they need to hear something, but most of them, they're going to do things their way.
So
that's what I have found.
If you were looking with working with young people like that right now, and you had some particularly bright talent that had all of the elements, the skill, the motivation, all the rest of it, what would you guide them in terms of making it in the field, connections, places to start? Where do they go based, from your experience?
Well, the only reason to go to school, well, besides learning a lot of things and being exposed to many other peoples, is to make connections and to learn that you don't have to get along with everybody. It's good to try to get along. But those connections that you make in school may be someone that you walk into an office 10 years from now, and they're in the position to hire you. So hopefully, when you were a student and they asked you for help, you helped them. Because if you didn't, they won't help you now. So I do tell them that whatever people you're meeting now, be helpful whenever you can, and that will be remembered. Because as filmmakers, we're struggling constantly, there's no money, and those people who help you, you remember them.
Do you think that the situation, this is maybe a silly question, but I want to anyway pose it for you to answer. Do you think the situation for Latinos now, today, in film, is harder than it is for other ethnic groups to get in and establish a foothold and produce a product? Or does everybody go through the same level of pain and hardship, blood, sweat, and tears?
That's a hard question, because there are some people who have the gift of getting along, helping, being charming, having talent, and they can get through no matter what, if they have the determination. Then there are those who may not have that gift, and the determination is going to be what is helpful to them. Yes, I do believe it's easier for white males to get in first. They can make mistakes and they'll be forgiven. So we have to work harder. Those people of color, women, have to work harder because that's how the program goes. That's how we've been programmed.
Now, Sylvia, are we talking about all sectors of the business when we talk like this? Are we talking about cinematographers, writers, people behind the camera, the directors? Are we talking about some of the people in front of the camera, some of the people who want to be on-camera talent? Are we having the same level at every segment of the business? Same problem?
No, I don't know for sure, but I don't think so. And that's just a gut reaction to what I know of the business.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's harder as an actor because there's so many who want to get in.
Yeah.
It's very hard. And usually, as a director or a storyteller, you have an idea of what you want. So one of the things I learned in directing and television, and episodic feature telling, is that an actor can come in and be wonderful. But in the director's eye, as wonderful as they are, they just don't fit the bill. So one of the things people need to learn that are in front of the camera is that don't take it personal. It may not have anything to do with your talent. It may have to do with that person had another idea. So unless you come in with an extraordinary interpretation of whatever role you're trying out for, you're not going to get cast.
But are you saying if you were a writer and you come up with a good product, you can? There's few enough people doing that well that you can break through?
I think writers have a better chance. I think they have a better chance than directors. A writer, right now, people, Chicano or Latino writers are being told, I don't want to hear about cartels. I don't want to hear about immigration. They just want to hear stories. They're interested in stories about Latinos.
Yeah.
Whether it's Cuban, whether it's Puerto Rican, whether it's Mexicano. They want those stories, but they don't want to hear the stories of immigration and cartel and narcotics.
And how about the technical fields like cinematography and sound and so forth?
Well, as long as you're good, and have a reel that just shows off your talent beautifully, you can get hired.
Yeah. We'll come back to you in a minute. I want to go to Tomas, who was kind of on the other side of the business, which was at a national foundation, Rockefeller, funding worthy projects of all kinds, but with a special look at Latino people and talent and stories and projects. Tomas has written some thoughts which would be appropriate for standing at the podium and delivering a speech. But I've asked him to hold those thoughts and share with us paragraphs, the most potent paragraphs of what he has written for today. But the larger question, Tomas, is just give us a picture of what the world looked like from where you sat all those years, and where do you think we stand today?
Well, first I want to thank MACRI for inviting me here. As a San Antoniano, I would like to, I wrote as an anciano, I keep forgetting, so I wrote a paper, and I will take little sections of the paper, and perhaps we can continue the discussion in that way. For me, in San Antonio, and I hope that you see back in the back lobby there's a wonderful display of films, theaters, pictures of people going to the movies, all in San Antonio. For me, a point of departure was the period following immediately after the Second World War. Returning Mexican-American GIs bought homes and attended college with the help of the GI Bill. 5 military bases provided steady employment and a small emerging middle class. Civil rights organizations like LULAC and the American GI Forum and other social, political, and cultural organizations continued historical patterns of civic and political mobilization. Long-established barrios and a vibrant Mexican downtown define a complete social-cultural universe. We had churches of many denominations to satisfy spiritual needs, and plenty of cantinas, salones de baile, and bordellos for sinners. A thriving economy fueled by small and mid-sized family-owned businesses stabilized security and well-being. A vibrant cultural ambiente was sustained by several Spanish language bookstores and publishing houses, Spanish radio, live theater, musical venues, many Mexican restaurants, and grand movie palaces. My teens coincided with the golden age of Mexican cinema, and films played an important educational function in fomenting notions of Mexicanidad. In our Mexico de afuera, movies represented ancestral heritage and contemporary culture. We could escape into the sophisticated, glamorous world of cosmopolitan Mexico City and the affluent bourgeoisie in tuxedos, evening gowns, and furs. Other films indoctrinated us into the ideals of the Mexican Revolution or documented El Mexico Profundo, chronicles of poor and indigenous peoples, peasants abandoning the ranchos and haciendas as Mexico changed from an agrarian past to an urban present. Our imaginations were expanded by the remarkable stories, the spectacular images, and the unforgettable performances of a glittering galaxy of now iconic movie stars like Pedro Infante, Dolores del Rio, Jorge Negrete, Maria Felix, and countless other Mexican films which fortified our cultural pride and identity. Now, Hollywood was very quick to find this, it was very quick and nimble in assessing a Spanish-speaking market for films in English with Mexican movie stars. Dolores del Rio, Ramon Navarro, Rita Hayward, and other Spanish-speaking actors and actresses found steady employment in films spoken in Spanish and dubbed in English. Few films made in Hollywood explored the historical and contemporary cultures of Mexico. The market was focused on Mexican vaqueros, cowboys and Indians, like the Lone Ranger and Tonto, that found steady employment in the U.S. following for a growing adolescent market. Now, I grew up with all of this background in terms of Mexican films and how important it was in making me aware of my Mexican cultural heritage. It was in the 1960s when the Chicano movement came that I really became aware in a larger context of the realities of our contemporary condition. At significant junctures of our human development, we ask and respond to fundamental questions concerning our self-identity, our history, and our future. The same questioning occurs within groups of people in particular moments in their historical trajectory. In the 1960s in the United States was such a period of introspection, analysis, and action. Mexican-American activists rebaptized ourselves as Chicanos, constituted themselves as historical subjects, struggled for self-determination, and radically decentered views of an essentialist, homogeneous national culture. We didn't feel that the U.S. was one culture, but that it was many cultures, and we were one of those many cultures that were essential to the basis of this particular United States. Artists in all creative disciplines were key animators in the social political scenarios of the period, the strikes, marches, sit-ins, and massive mobilizations for social justice. Multidisciplinary artists wrote and voiced the poems, danced the ancient rituals, painted the images, and composed the songs and slogans of solidarity that were shouted by marching multitudes. Viva la raza, long live the people. Chicano power, si se puede, we can do it. Self-determination was buttressed by a compelling cultural vision for justice and equity. Now, filmmakers were in the vanguard, focused on creating un nuevo arte del pueblo, creating films within a matrix of cultural, political, and artistic frameworks that united lo mexicano, art forms derived from our mestizo historical culture, and lo americano, the experience of making a living and making a life in the United States. Some very quick survey of some of the films that I remember. Filmmakers like Jesus Treviño, Lourdes Portillo, Luis Valdés, Héctor Galán, and Silvia Morales were among other pioneers in using the medium of film to evoke personal and collective stories in documentary and full-length feature films. An incomplete survey would include Águeda Martínez, an intimate portrait of an ancient anciana in rural New Mexico who cultivated the land and lived following ancient rites and traditions. Another film, Ernest Palomino wrote and directed a film, and an experimental film called A Trip in My Chevy, in my 52 Chevy. A breakthrough feature film was Luis Valdés in 1967's film, I Am Joaquin, that started out as a slideshow and was essentially a reading of Jorge González's epic poem, Yo Soy Joaquin. Silvia Morales' feminist film, Chicana, explored women's conscience and consciousness. Both I Am Joaquin and Chicana are now part of the National Film Archive. Another early feature film was the bilingual Please Don't Bury Me Alive, Por favor, no me entierren vivo. Finally, crashing the Hollywood glass ceiling, not really breaking it, but at least sort of crashing it, were films as dissimilar as Selena, La Familia, El Norte, and film by Cheech and by Cheech and Chong. Also, Bless Mi Ultima and Isaac Eisenstein's Break of Dawn. Chicanos by Silvia Morales and Héctor Galán, the film we're talking about today, is a major opus telling the Chicano story through multiple documentary episodes focused on education, labor, and history. Funding for this important film was extremely difficult. And finally, it was a composite of local foundations, state or art agencies, and national foundations, and many other sources that finally got put together to make the film. I was one of the funders when, during the time when I was an associate director for the humanities and culture at the Rockefeller Foundation. When I received a prospectus for the project of Chicano, I was deeply impressed with the film's potential to tell an American story that focused on an asset model rather than a deficiency model. It was a film that talked about the positive things that we had done, the positive culture, the positive ideas that sustained us in our communities, rather than seeing us as bandidos or poor or deficient. So the film is very significant still today in showing those aspects of our culture.
Gracias, Tomás. Let's hear it for Tomás. That's beautiful. That is a beautiful review of sort of modern history of Chicanos in film and the cultural arts. Beautifully done, and could only have been done by putting as much time as you did into writing it. Gracias. Thank you for that special effort. To this point, we've been focusing on Chicano as Tomás said, an opus of a film. and full of sort of portent of what's possible. But I think MACRI has led us to think about the future. Where are we? Where are we going? What can we do to help? Let me just tell you a few brief words personally about my involvement on the periphery of all of this. When I left as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, I got a call from Univision that was without a president of the parent company, Univision Communications. And they asked me whether I would come out to Los Angeles and consider being the president. And my previous association, I'd done a lot of television, including a program called Texans that we did here weekly for a while, interview program of Texas figures. And of course had a long relationship with the Cortez family that built KCOR Radio and then later KWEX, Emilio Nicolas, the Cortez family, etc. But I'd never run a broadcasting company. But I was selected to do it, decided to go out and do it, and spent 4 years as president of Univision and had some insight there, although it's a very different business model, because in those days, the Univision model was use programming from Mexico, which was already produced, the telenovelas, and what was the Univision contribution to the network was the local newscast, the national newscast, Jorge Ramos, etc., Maria Elena Solinas and others, and then all of the so-called game shows, some made in the U.S., some like Sábado Gigante and Siempre en Domingo in Mexico. So it didn't have a large potential to spill over into Chicano art and capability because it just wasn't part of the structure. During that period, I became very close to Moctezuma Esparza, who helped in the founding of what we now call the New America Alliance, which is a group of Latinos who were in business responsibilities. And Moctezuma was our premier movie producer-director. He did films like Selena, Gettysburg, Viva Seguin, and multiple others. He's got a long pedigree of films, very good pieces of work. Some of them got awards, not for the filming, some for the music, like the Gettysburg tape is still highly respected. And Moctezuma really put his heart and soul into gaining more participation for Latinos in U.S. films. He subsequently bought a theater chain and operated that until the pandemic basically made theaters obsolete. There just were no people to be in theaters, and you can't run that real estate and those entities with no customers. Moctezuma called me about 2 months ago, and he wants to restart, redouble, accelerate the effort to open the door for Latinos. Over the years, he and I had collaborated, for example, in finding young Latino directors, producers with films and introducing them in Hollywood to see whether they could be picked up by companies. There were some very good pieces of work. Some of them showed that the people were young and inexperienced, and they ran, 2 hours of beautiful facial shots, but not much story, et cetera. So, it takes work. It takes honing those skills, and everybody worked at it. But the long and short is, it appears to me at this juncture, we're not much farther than we were 20 years ago in terms of the number of Latinos who are in the business, succeeding in the business, the openness, although there have been some breakthroughs, because we're looking up for breakthroughs by almost any definition, but movies like Coco, Disney, which they thought was a big contribution, and I think it was, at least for a mass audience, and others that have followed. But we have a very long way to go. And considering how far we've come as a people, where we're now 50 million, almost 60 million Latinos out of 300 million plus Americans, and considering our contribution in the economy, and considering our participation in the schools as the next majority, already the majority in many, many city school systems, we're nowhere near where we ought to be in terms of the representation in the media, on camera, or behind the camera, or in the production operation, or in the financing. So let me just ask a quick question of the audience before we go to the next round of discussion, because we've been focusing on a platform, what got us to a point. I want to spend a little time on going forward, but I want to know something about the interests of the audience. I'm going to ask you about 5 questions, and you raise your hand for the one that's appropriate to you. How many of you are here because you are young and studying film, or have ambitions to be in film, or trying your first shot at doing something in the film sector? Raise your hands if we have people in the audience. There's one hand back here. Okay, got it. How many of you are here because you want to see the situation improve and you're involved somehow in doing something, either as investors or, okay, I see hands over here and here. Cecilia back here, okay. How many of you involved because you don't, did I see Johnny, did I see your hand? No. Okay, Johnny Reyna's a doctor, but he's as a doctor, he has great interest. How many of you are here because you say, if I had the opportunity to back somebody or invest to move the ball forward, and such people were present and we could assemble support for them, I would be interested in being supportive? Can I see the hands of those who fall in that category? Okay. And how many of you are here because basically you think there's a wrong and it needs to be helped, fixed, don't know quite exactly what the answer is, but this is an interesting part of our Chicano experience and you're just interested in the subject? Can I see the hands of those? Okay. Many of you fall in that category. Okay. All right, good. That helps me in going forward here. Sara, I don't know how we're doing on time. You'd give me a signal when we come to the end of our session. Oh, my goodness. Okay. Okay, here's what we're going to do. 5 minutes per speaker. We have 3 speakers. Is that okay? All right. So I want to chart where we go from here. And Hector, Tomas, Sylvia, with all of your experience, what lies ahead, realistically? Not what we wish, but what do we have to do to change the dynamic and get, it seems to me we were making some decent progress. The pandemic wiped the legs out of a lot of the business, generally, not just for Mexicanos, but generally. Pandemic has been terribly disruptive. The theater industry almost doesn't exist. People are now doing Netflix and Hulu and HBO specials, et cetera, but very little in the theaters, right? So we don't know what the shape of the industry is going forward. And secondly, I don't have a feel for how we're going to create opportunity for that generation of younger Latinos who's aching to get into business, has something to say, but the structure is just so amorphous. Where are we going?
Well, see, I think you had asked the question. I think it's a two-pronged question.
Okay.
I think opportunities, especially for the newer generations, the younger people, those that are either studying or working in the field, I think those opportunities are very good. I think, like Sylvia mentioned, if you've got talent, you want to be an editor, you want to be a shooter, you want to be, a writer, you're gonna get there, and there's a lot more doors open for you now than they were when I was coming up.
That's right.
But I think we haven't really progressed that much on the content. Like, for instance, if you want to do a Latino story and, you want to sell it to Hollywood, well, good luck. Because it's just as difficult to do that, and I'm talking about documentaries too, than it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Now, Telemundo is a different model, Univision, I mean, because they were aiming at that Spanish-speaking audience, at the more recent arrival audience, and that's really what killed a lot of the Tejano music, this banda stuff and everything. So when we talk about content, stories, good stories, those are still very hard to get done. Feature films. Now, I know that there's one feature film being filmed right now here in San Antonio, Nancy de los Santos rom-com, Latino rom-com, which is pretty good. But we could use more. And I think given social media, given the YouTubes, given the streaming, given all of that, that's all available that we didn't have before. So that dynamic is changing. Before, like for instance, in my business, PBS, right? So you do documentaries. Well now, and as a matter of fact, at one time they were talking about the death of the documentary format. Well, that never happened. And now you've got so many streaming services with documentaries, it's amazing. So there's those opportunities that are wide open and it's just grabbing, but it's still a struggle when it comes to content.
Thank you. And if we don't get a chance to thank you again before the panel is over, thank you for your many, many contributions, your career, and your tireless willingness to give back to the community. Gracias. Thank you, Hector. Sylvia, your thoughts about the future?
Yes, I agree with Hector. And taking Nancy de los Santos, Nancy has been writing for years, and she's been writing and writing and writing and honing her craft. And I was at her tryout where she had a reading of her script that she's doing now, apparently, and it was hilarious. I think we can't think about doing a Latino story. You just have to think about doing a story that you love, that works for you. You don't have to you don't have to think I gotta make a story about my community. No, you make a story about that subject, and then perhaps it's probably about your community to begin with. So try not to, think about doing stories about, I gotta do about my Mexicanness or my this, that, or whatever. You do a story of what you see that interests you. And most likely what interests you is Latino, so they'll be in there already. But you really have to work at it. At writing, we need the content because we have the technology down. We have a lot of ADs. We have cinematographers and we have directors. It's the content. I'm reading a biography by Oliver Stone called Chasing the Light. And he wrote and he wrote and he wrote, and he was driving cabs, he was doing everything he could, and he was getting rejected. Finally, he wrote something, Platoon, and that was his experience in Vietnam. And it was read by some people, and they didn't do Platoon. They hired him to write Midnight Express because they liked his writing so much on Platoon because he had lived it. Now, I'm not saying that the writer should write something that they've lived. Use your imagination, write about something that you just want to write about, but it has to be good.
So let me draw on your experience, and Hector as well. Speak up. Name the best Latino product that you can think of in the last 10 years on the criteria that you just described. Content. Selena the movie or Selena the feature? Or Battle of Gregorio Cortés, which was
wonderful.
Moctezuma.
Yeah, that was wonderful.
Talk me through a couple just off the top of your head.
Well, Selena, of course, was wonderful. It was very simple. It had one driving force, La Bamba also, El Norte, Stand and Deliver. That was about a teacher, so there was a driving force in that. West Side Story recently. I know some people put it down. I thought it was great, and it produced a lot of young talent. ¿Cómo se llama? Ariana DeBose. She was great, and she's multi-talented. So it gave a lot of. Let me see. There's Spy Kids. Yeah. Real Women Have Curves. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it was about a nice little story. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's a great survey. What thoughts come to you?
Well, it's interesting that Sylvia's mentioning, because there was a plethora of films at one point, I think. A lot of them that you mentioned.
Like before the pandemic, yeah.
Yeah, but we haven't really had, it really surprises me that somebody like Luis Valdez, who did one of the most amazing films, La Bamba, is not out there, as one of our doing major Hollywood productions.
There's a reason for that, but there's a reason for that. He hated Hollywood.
Yeah.
He couldn't stand working with them. So he just went back to San Juan Bautista.
Because that film, La Bamba, is one of the, made a lot of money, and it was actually a very good film.
Tell me quickly about Luis Miranda. Obviously, there's a person who knows how to tell a story.
Yeah, really, he's
a genius. He's a genius.
Yeah.
I know his father, and people tell me from when he was at Wesleyan in college that he was doing plays for the university theater group, and people would say, this guy is absolutely destined to be something. Just tell me what you think, what's the skill set there?
For Luis?
Luis.
Oh, my God. I mean, you know, well, Teatro Campesino, I first heard of them when I was in the Chicano movement, of course. Mm-hmm. And I'd see their plays, and I really related to that. But, you know, recently I worked with Luis. He narrated Willie Velasquez. I went to L.A. and we recorded.
I'm talking about Luis Miranda from New York.
Oh, Luis Miranda. I thought you were talking about Luis Valdez.
No.
No, Luis Miranda, I thought In the Heights was incredible.
Yeah.
I really, really enjoyed it. And, you know, it was family friendly. It was great. And it was on Netflix. And because Netflix, you know, if you want to do something with Latino theme, they always push you to the Mexican. There's a big Netflix in Mexico. And there's a Mexican, like Taco Chronicles and a lot of those shows. And they want to put you there, whereas In the Heights was more general mainstream.
Let me ask
I thought you were talking about Luis Valdez.
No. Let me ask you and Sylvia, and then we'll go to Tomas. Are you optimistic about Latinos in the film sector going forward?
Yes,
you're
because I see a lot of, listen, when I'm watching any shows on television and movies on television, because they're streamed in now, I look at the credits, and there's a lot of Spanish surnames on there, which gives me a lot of hope. I think one of the things that's important, and I think this is going to take time, is that we have also got to be very aware of our mestizaje, of our Afro-Latin roots, also Latino roots. We got the indigenous roots. We have to be aware of all of that and bring them into our stories.
Good point. Optimistic?
Oh yeah, I am.
Yeah.
I think it's a great future.
What keeps you going?
Well, right now I'm starting to work on my archives. I've got like 10,000 hours of film. When we did Chicano, one of the big problems that we had was a lack of film and video. When the Black Civil Rights Movement was going on in the Deep South, like Freedom Summer and Edmund Pettus Bridge and all those major, you had all these filmmakers coming down from New York City filming all of that. And a lot of them wound up in Hollywood later on in life. They're young makers. We didn't have that during the Chicano movement. So some of the most incredible stuff that we found were in people's closets, forgotten films. And so I think now we have a good historical record. And of course, you know, I've been filming for, you know, over 40 years now. And so I have a lot of Latino history. He talked about vaqueros and, you know, World War II. You know, I've done movies on all of those aspects of our culture. And I'm working on that, and I'm going to keep doing films.
Can I say one thing?
Tomas, yes. I want to get to Tomas.
Yeah, I want to get to Tomas too. And Tomas, thank you for showing us that we have no manners, because you thanked everybody. And my mother would not be proud of me right now for not having thanked Sarah and everybody and Henry for moderating. Thank you. But I just want to say one more thing, and that is, I mean, it pleased me to hear you say, Henry, that you were part of some infrastructure for a while, but it wasn't serving your needs, apparently. But that's what we need right now, to really get in there. We need an infrastructure of people who are interested in all good stories. That no matter where they come from, as long as they're good stories, they will take it. But right now, the infrastructure is not in our favor.
You've been tremendous. Tomas, looking forward, the future, are you optimistic about Latinos in film?
Well, I'd like to make 2 points. One, I still, with all the work that all of us have talked about, And with the recognition that Latino artistic expressions have made fundamental contributions to North American culture, we are still largely unrecognized and conspicuously absent in most white American consciousness. Chicano Latino artists, including filmmakers, continue to struggle against historical amnesia and cultural erasure. But in a positive way,
Can't hear you.
in a positive way, the filmmakers throughout the country, there are many in cities like Chicago, San Antonio, Los Angeles, there are annual Latino film festivals that serve as incubators for local filmmakers. The oldest Chicano Film Festival in the country is in San Antonio, and it premieres local, national, and international films. The Chicano Cine Festival also includes stories showing of historical Mexican films of the Golden Age in order to offer the antecedents of today's fundamental work, with sold-out houses that prove that that our community is very interested in the films. So I think it's on the one hand, I think that people still are fighting cultural amnesia and historical erasure. On the other hand, we have many attempts from our own community with our own resources, with our own growing resources, to create and establish a place where people can learn about their history and culture, as was mentioned today, in many different ways, in education and so on. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because I think that that in today's dystopic, grim, and dark times, amid a global civic pandemic, we're also witnessing natural disasters of hurricanes, uncountable fires, and global warming, together with gun violence and crimes. But among all of this, I still use one word. I still remain optimistic and cling to the notion of esperanza, hope. We all hope that those we love will continue to be with us and love us in return. We hope that tomorrow will be better and safer than today, and trust that our Chicano, Latino, ex-cultural workers will continue to lift our spirits and inspire us. Still with our artistic visions and stories, let filmmakers and films lead the way with filmic representations of a world full of resonance and wonder and hope, where nothing is too wondrous not to be true. Let it be so, and let the filmmakers lead the way. Gracias.
Fantastic, beautiful. So, we have been blessed today to have three venerable veterans of Latino film to reflect on the past and to set forth some of their thinking about the future. It's a wonderful thing. Thank you to those of you in the audience for being available on a Saturday afternoon to hear these people's thoughts and to do what you can, for whatever reason, in the show of hands that we had earlier, a whole different range of motivations, but all of us, as Tomas has so brilliantly said, hopeful and willing to do our part. Thank you to MACRI for setting up the opportunity to talk about these things, and more importantly, for reminding all of us constantly to work on building a better Latino future. Yes, absolutely.
For those who were here, and our theme was 25 years since the making of Chicano. For those that haven't seen Chicano and you're curious of seeing Chicano, the series that Sylvia and I worked on, I'm going to donate a copy to MACRI. And you can always go to MACRI and watch whichever episode you want. Right now, you know, it's shown in universities and schools everywhere. But if you haven't seen it, go to MACRI and watch it.
Thank you all, and thank you, Sara. Sylvia, thank you very much for being with us from a distance.
Thank you.
Can we just give it up for these legends? Thank you so much. I can't believe it, but that concludes MACRI's 2022 symposium. On behalf of the board and staff, thank you for joining us for this event. I hope you've been motivated to learn more about the civil rights history and issues we've learned about over the last 2 days. I want to thank our host, the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. I want to thank Cecilia, Bailly, Jorge Pena, Jorge Gamboa, Maya across the street at the bookstore. Thank you so much for your hospitality here at the beautiful Historic Guadalupe Theater. I want to encourage everybody, if you're local, to support the Guadalupe and all the wonderful year-round programming they do here, including Cine Festival, the oldest Latino film festival in the country. And if you're not in San Antonio, then find your local Latino Performing Arts Center and support them. I also want to thank Screenville Films for providing the live stream of the symposium over the last 2 days. It's not easy work, thank you. I want to thank our sponsors, AARP, Democratizing Racial Justice, the City of San Antonio, Bexar County, the Mexican American Bar Association of San Antonio, the Herrera Law Firm, the Mellon Foundation, and of course the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. Thank you. I really hope you enjoyed this program, and I invite you to attend more of our MACRI programs. If you follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, you will receive program updates, and you can put it on your calendar. We do hope to see you again. Thank you so much, and that's a wrap.